Okay, we're going to talk about tuning stability, the sources of tuning instability, and some techniques to maximize stability. So we'll first talk about why your guitar goes out of tune right after you tune it. Then we'll get into how to keep your guitar from going out of tune, starting with some tuning technique. Then we'll get into lubricating friction points, mechanical issues, and we'll switch gears over to tremolos, starting off with how they work, with Fender-style tremolos. Then we'll get into Floyd Rose tremolos, and finally, what I consider a very important topic, and that is tremolo stabilizers. So the mechanics of tuning. This is pretty straightforward, but just to revisit this, the three things determine the pitch of a string. The tension, how tight the string is pulled, the string gauge, how thick the string is, and the length of the string. So, keep in mind that's why at a given tension and a given string thickness, you can fret a note and it goes to a higher pitch than it was when it was open. So that's just sort of what we're getting at with the length of the string there. All right, so what goes wrong after you tune a string? Basically, changes in the tension that then get caught at the friction points along the string's path and cause different amounts of tension along different points in the string. So, for example, if you look at the row on the top in the graphic at the right, you'll see, starting on the before diagram, when your string has just been tuned, you might have some nice even tension along the entire length of the string, and it is the correct amount of tension for the pitch that you're trying to get with that string. And then you go and you do a bend. That's that during graphic where you see the whole string goes red. You've increased the tension along the entire length of the string. That has raised the pitch, which was the effect you were going after. Great. But then you release the bend, and what happens is the increased tension up at the headstock and down near the bridge didn't quite get released because the string basically caught on the nut and the saddles. And so you have higher tension at those points, and as a result, you have a little bit extra slack in the middle part of the string where you actually do your playing. So when the string has been released, it goes flat on you. And then down in the second row, you'll see sort of the reverse if you were to use a tremolo to do a dive, although I probably shouldn't have used a Les Paul for the graphic. So let's talk about tuning technique to get around this. A lot of people don't do this. I'm not really sure why, but basically you need to do a bend after each adjustment to the tuning pegs. So, if let's say a string is a little bit flat, tighten up the tuning peg a little bit, then do a bend, and then check what the actual note looks like on your tuner. If you're checking the note before you've done a bend, it's kind of a meaningless reference point. What you're doing when you do this is you're allowing that higher tension to exist at the headstock and down by the saddles, but basically you're just welcoming it and letting it then exist so that the middle part of the string is actually correctly tuned, and that way when you do bends, it keeps returning back to the correct pitch that you want it to be at. This, however, will be frustrated by any dives that you do with a tremolo, so we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so the next thing you can do to help with tuning instability issues would be to lubricate those friction points and help minimize some of this effect that we're talking about. Now, there are roller nuts out there that allow you to basically have theoretically a zero friction nut. A lot of people aren't too big on them. I'm not quite convinced it's a good answer, but you certainly can lubricate a traditional nut or saddle to get much less friction on it. So, how do you do it? Pretty simple. If you have a metal friction point, so that would be your saddles and string trees if you have them, such as on a Stratocaster, you just use a little bit of chapstick on those friction points. And then on a nut, you put a little bit of graphite, pencil lead. You just kind of basically draw with a pencil right into the nut slot where the string goes through, and that will help lubricate those points. You don't need to get any sort of fancy gear for this to happen. So then let's get into mechanical problems that might not be solvable with those techniques. The first thing that everybody thinks of is that they have slipping tuners. Slipping tuners are not rare, but you will definitely know if you have a slipping tuner. It's super obvious. First off, when you tune the guitar, you'll feel that it's loose and it feels sort of broken at the little peg when you turn it. And then when it slips, it doesn't usually slip in anything subtle of a manner. It's a pretty obvious sort of ping, and you can see the little peg turn a little bit, and the string comes loose. Usually is going to go 2 full steps flat or something like that. So if you have a problem with your tuning pegs, you're probably going to know it. If you think you have a problem with your tuning pegs, that's probably not the culprit. One last thing on that, I talked before about you probably don't need a roller nut. You also don't need locking tuners. I'm not aware of any working tuner that you could pull hard enough on your string to make it move without breaking the string first. So if your tuning heads are slipping, it's because they're broken, not because you need locking tuners. Okay, and then the next place that you might have tuning problems, this is much more common and much less obvious, would be vintage saddles. So if you take a look at the picture on the right and you look at that high E string, you'll see that it has slipped over off of the saddle, the main center part of the saddle, and is now resting partially on the little Allen screw that adjusts the height of the saddle. So this kind of a thing will definitely mess with your tuning. Basically, as you're bending, you're moving that string left to right, and it starts slipping across the top of the saddle. It's going to mess up your tuning. It's going to mess up your intonation. So you might want to either talk to a guitar tech about maybe putting a groove into those saddles, or just go with more modern saddles that actually have a groove already. The other thing you might notice that's going on here is that the saddles themselves have gotten a little bit fanned out across the plate of the tremolo mechanism. So that's also going to have a similar effect of allowing it to go out of tune rather easily. The last thing that you might run across, although really only in a pretty bad quality guitar, would be nut grooves that are too shallow and similarly allow that string to move laterally outside of the slots that the string is supposed to reside in. Okay, so let's shift gears to tremolos, starting with the basics. A tremolo basically balances the strings against some springs that are in the backside of the guitar, and this balance then has a pivot point, which is usually some sort of a knife edge, and you have this bar that lets you basically pivot it one way or the other to throw off that balance temporarily. So that's a little bit sort of a geeky explanation for it. And at the right, you'll see the patent drawings from the original Fender tremolo mechanism. And now let's talk about why that can raise some issues for you. So starting with Stratocaster style tremolos. If you look at the top right picture here, that's the vintage 6-screw style Stratocaster tremolo. And here the fulcrum is the screws themselves are the fulcrum. They're basically loosely screwed in, and the plate pivots within against the edges of those screws. The more modern 2-point style tremolo is shown below, and here you have knife edges on the edge of the tremolo plate, and that presses up against these posts. So you just have a little less wiggle room for error, a little more tuning stability. Okay, so most of these are going to have a screw-in arm. Some of the more modern ones will be pop-in. That's really not too important. Now, I do recommend generally with Fender-style tremolos that you set them up as dive only. And my reasons are going to be sort of covered in a couple slides when we get to the tremolo stabilizers. But there is one advantage to keeping them floating. So you'll notice in these pictures, the tremolos are both lifted at the sort of butt end of them. They're about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch off of the face of the guitar, and that lets you bend up with a note a little bit by pulling on the bar. The advantage to that is that when you do a dive with a tremolo, you throw off the tuning, as we discussed earlier. And having done a bend at the beginning of your tuning process doesn't counteract for this. In fact, it might make it worse. However, if you go and you always follow a dive by doing a bend back up on the tremolo, that can help undo some of that. That said, you can't usually do that big of a pitch bend up with the Stratocaster tremolo. Even if you have them set as you see in the picture, you're only getting a small change in the pitch, and it's probably not going to fix the tuning issues that you would have caused by doing a big dive. So back to as I started, I recommend setting them up so that they are in dive only mode, where basically they're tightened up to the point where they're just flush against the body. Other issues from floating that you'll notice would be that they are just generally difficult to tune. Anytime you have a tremolo that's fully floating, you tune one string and say you raise the pitch on it, you have tightened it. And by tightening it, you have pulled the whole tremolo mechanism up a little bit. And so your other 5 strings have gone loose as a result, and they've dropped in pitch. And you just kind of run in circles chasing your tail. You tune all 6 strings, and then you go back and the first one is back out of tune again, and you have to start over and over. So it's a little bit of a nuisance to tune. Also, doing a bend on one string will typically cause your other strings to go flat for the same reason that was mentioned before. When you did the bend, you've increased the tension on it, you've pulled the whole tremolo mechanism closer, so all your other strings have gone flat. It makes doing doing any kind of synchronous bending technique not really work well. Okay, so the Floyd Rose tremolo, which you probably saw lots of in 80s hair metal videos, was designed to fix a lot of the problems with the Fender style tremolo that we just looked at. And the main differences would be that the Floyd Rose tremolo is what's called a double locking tremolo. So it still has a knife edge, but now it's added that it basically clamps down on the string at both of the friction points at either end of the playing area. So it clamps at the nut, and there's no movement past the nut that's possible, and then it clamps again down at the saddles. So again, there's no friction point. It's just basically locked in place. So that prevents having that slippage that we talked about earlier, and it adds tremendous tuning stability, much better. So you can do dives and bends and everything else, and you let go and it goes right back into tune. So this is great, and I'm generally a fan of the Floyd Rose style tremolo. However, there's a major problem still with the Floyd Rose, and that is basically, as we just discussed with the Fender style, these are floating, or at least they're typically mounted floating, and as a result, it's very difficult to get them in tune in the first place. If you want to go to drop D, you're going to have to spend 10 minutes tinkering with it before you can get it back in tune. It has little fine tuners that allow you to make minor changes to the tuning, but if you're going to go all the way down to a D, and you might be able to get that much adjustment out of the fine tuner, but you're not going to get enough out of the other 5 to bring the rest of the strings back in tune after you do that adjustment. So I personally find that a floating trem, even a Floyd Rose, if it doesn't have any sort of a trem stabilizer, is still kind of maddening to work with, but we'll come back to that. They can be mounted as dive only, as I mentioned before, although unlike a Fender style tremolo where you just tighten the springs up a little bit and that sets it up that way, here the guitar has to be routed for that from the manufacturer at the time of building the guitar. The routing template is totally different for a full floating versus a dive only setup. So that's not something you can change once you've bought the guitar. All right, so now let's get to the really important topic when you're talking about tremolos and tuning stability, and that would be tremolo stabilizers. So basically, a tremolo stabilizer makes a tremolo want to return back to the flat position, the neutral position. It doesn't force it to be stuck in that position. There are some gadgets like that basically just lock it in position and disable the tremolo completely. Here, with these stabilizers, as you see on the right, they all still keep everything sprung and moving, so you're still able to use the tremolo. It just basically makes it want to stop at the center point a little bit. And it doesn't mess with the feel all that much, although some people complain about them a bit. And basically, all of them work on the same principle, and that is that you have more pull from the springs in the cavity as the tremolo is in a dive position than you do when it crosses the neutral point and goes into an up bending position. As you're pulling up on the tremolo. And the way that's accomplished is you have a spring that basically connects or disconnects as you move past that center point. So what's interesting is if you look at these pictures on the right, the Ibanez system in the bottom right has 4 tremolo springs that pull on the tremolo to counterbalance against the springs. But the 2 outer springs have a little catch mechanism, and as the tremolo gets to the midpoint, the neutral position, they catch there and they no longer pull any further. So you have basically a drop off in the amount of spring down to just those center 2 springs continue to pull. And that's why it kind of wants to stop at that position. There are still some springs to help you if you want to bend beyond that position. It still has more range of motion. It just has a little bit of a change in the spring rate, and as a result, it stops briefly in that position until you overcome it. Now, you'd think that the ESP arming adjuster and the Ibanez backstop, which are pictured also there, work on a different mechanism because they seem to be pushing and they basically look like they're doing the opposite thing. But if you think about it, what's actually happening there if you focus on, say, the ESP arming adjuster, is that the 2 outer springs are able to have full force until they touch the ESP arming adjuster, and then because it's pushing, it's basically reducing the amount that they're able to pull. It's fighting them a little bit. So with the Ibanez, you have more help until you reach the center point and then less help. With the ESP, you have no fight until you reach the center point, and then you have it fighting a little bit. So it really accomplishes exactly the same thing, that it reduces the amount of spring pull as you cross past that neutral point. So these are fantastic. They give you the tuning stability that you would expect from a fixed bridge, plus you still have the locking saddles and the locking nut, so that actually gives you greater tuning stability than a fixed bridge guitar. You can go to drop D with these and it won't mess up the other 5 strings, at least not significantly. Your neck may bend a little bit, so they might go 1 or 2 cents out of tune, but basically it stays in tune. String bends don't cause your other strings to go flat, and if you set them up right, you can actually get it to the point where a string can break and the other 5 will still stay more or less in tune. So here are the problems. For some reason, these are rarely included from the factory and they're difficult to find. I've heard arguments that say that there might be a patent that Gibson has that impacts this. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense because it would be an old patent and probably expired at this point. But for one reason or another, manufacturers don't usually include these in guitars, and they're not easy to find even aftermarket. As a result, your guitar tech might have a hard time actually knowing how to set it up right for you. So you might need to do a little bit of research on that yourself and just play with it to figure out how you like it to feel. The last thing that is highly over-publicized about these, but it is very true, is that they will kill flutter. So to the extent that you like to get that little flutter noise with a Floyd Rose tremolo, these will disable your ability to do that. I personally don't really understand why anyone cares about flutter. It's not a very pleasant sound. I don't really know of any songs where that's a hallmark of the sound, but hey. If that's something that's really important to you, then you're not going to be able to use a tremolo stabilizer. So some conclusions. Most of your tuning instability results from poor tuning technique. So just always perform a bend before you check your tuning. Your tuning machines are probably not a problem, and if they are, you'll know it. Vintage style saddles are often problematic and are less obvious. If you have a non-locking tremolo, you're pretty much always going to end up with a sharp note after you dive. Your strings are going to go a little sharp. On the other hand, if you have a double locking tremolo, it'll be nice and stable while you use it, but tuning changes are going to be problematic and string bends and such are all problematic. All of those issues can be resolved by using a tremolo stabilizer, and you get excellent tuning stability. So just to sort of close it out, I have an Ibanez that has the ZPS3 system that was pictured before. And I find that guitar rarely goes more than 1 or 2 cents out of tune, even after weeks of use. I also just recently got an ESP that does not yet have a tremolo stabilizer in it, and it just was a reminder of how maddening it can be to actually work with even a nice Floyd Rose mechanism before you have a trem stabilizer in there. So that would be it.